The first cruelty of the morning was meant to be quiet, but Wren Ashford heard every word of it through the tackroom door. The Duke would sooner set fire to his own stables than let that stray girl near the black horse again, said the head groom, and the laughter that followed was the small, comfortable laughter of men who had already decided a thing and were only savoring the decision. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give them the satisfaction of a flinch, though her hand, resting on the worn leather of a bridle she had been oiling since before the bell for the servants' breakfast, tightened once around the cheekpiece and then, deliberately, let go. Ravenhold, in the last raw week of March in the year the old Duke died and the young one came home, breathed around her like a house that had learned to hold its tongue in the presence of strangers. The great stable block, 4 wings around a cobbled yard, exhaled the mingled warmth of 40 horses into an air still edged with frost, and the frost, in return, laid its thin, polite hand upon every window pane and would not be brushed away. She had come here at 14, a parson's orphan with a letter of introduction and a mother's ring sewn into the hem of her only cloak, and she was 20 now. And in those 6 years she had learned the exact weight of every bucket in the yard, and the exact temperature at which a bran mash comforted a colicky yearling, and the exact silence with which one accepted being called stray by men who had known her name for half a decade. Stray. It was the assigned word. It sat over her like a coat cut for someone else and never altered, and the household wore it with the small, easy cruelty of a household that had never troubled to look under the collar. The tackroom smelled of neatsfoot oil and old saddle soap and the faint iron tang of a bit newly polished, and beneath these, threaded through them the way a hidden stitch runs through a hem, the emotional scent of a place waiting to see who would be blamed for something that had not yet happened. On the peg above her head hung a plain snaffle bridle her father had mended once, in the year before his fever, using a strip of harness leather cut from an old plow rein and a length of waxed thread that no one but her would ever recognize as her mother's. It was not a beautiful thing. It was not even, by the standards of the great house, an appropriate thing to keep in a duke's tackroom. It was a working bridle, oiled dark by 6 years of her own hands, and its brow band bore, stitched almost invisibly along the underside, where only a person turning it inward could ever find them, 3 small letters in the same waxed thread. E.A.W. For Eliza Ann Wren, who had been buried on a Tuesday in a village churchyard with no headstone that Wren could afford, and no mourners save a sexton and a girl of 13, who had not yet been given the word stray, but was already, in the eyes of the parish, moving quietly toward it. Do the small things well, and the large things will not be able to overlook you, her mother had said, holding up a mended sleeve to the window as though the sun might approve it. It was a plain sentence. It had the homely metaphor of a needlewoman's kitchen. It named, without seeming to, the whole of a life. Wren had carried it out of the churchyard the way another child might have carried a locket, and she carried it still. And it was the reason her hand had not shaken at the tackroom door, and would not shake now. Do the small things well. She set the oiled bridle back upon its peg, adjusted the reins so they hung evenly, and stepped out into the yard as though she had heard nothing, because to have heard was to have been given the satisfaction. And satisfaction, she had long ago decided, was a coin she did not owe them. The yard was busy in the way that yards are busy an hour before a great man's household stirs, which is to say that everyone was working and no one was hurrying, and every hurry that did occur was performed with an eye toward being seen hurrying. Grooms in fresh shirts let out the carriage bays for exercise. A boy with a barrow of soiled straw crossed toward the muck heap with the studied gravity of a boy who has been told, for the 3rd morning in a row, that the new Duke walks early. Above the archway that separated the working yard from the manicured drive, the Ravenhold crest, a raven passant over 3 crossed hazel branches, caught what pale sunlight there was and returned it grudgingly. Wren crossed the cobbles at the unhurried pace of a person who has learned that any faster gait invites correction. And she did not look at the head groom, Josiah Blunt, as she passed him. And he did not look at her, and their mutual not looking was a small daily ritual as fixed and as understood between them as the ringing of the yard bell. He had been head groom under the old Duke for 11 years. He had a florid, handsome, weather-worn face, and the loud, easy laugh of a man who had been the second son of a country attorney and had risen. And he had risen just far enough to know exactly whom he might safely tread upon. And he trod, when he trod, with a smile. "Ashford," he said as she reached the far side of the yard, and he said it the way a person tosses a small coin toward a beggar he does not intend to pay again. "The bay mare in the 3rd box. Poultice her off hock. And when you're done there, the tack for the new Duke's hunter wants doing over. Wants doing properly, mind." "Yes, Mr. Blunt," she said. It was not a question. It was not quite an insult. It was the 8th time that week he had assigned her to the poultice work that had been, in the old Duke's day, the first task of the youngest boy in the yard. And he had assigned it because Wren, in the previous autumn, had quietly reset a poulticed leg that a stable lad had bandaged too tight, and had saved a valuable animal. And the head groom, who had bandaged the leg himself in a hurry and had blamed the lad, had never forgiven her the correction. She went to the 3rd box and knelt to the mare's off hock and made a fresh linseed poultice with hands that were red at the knuckles and steady at the fingers. And while she worked, she listened, because a stable is a house of listeners, and Wren had been, since childhood, the quietest one in every room she entered. From the yard, the voice of Mr. Blunt, magnified for an audience of grooms, and, more importantly, for the ears of the housekeeper's boy who was even now crossing toward the servants' hall. From the arcade, the softer, cooler voice of Mrs. Holbrook, the housekeeper, who had never entirely approved of a girl in the stables and expressed her disapproval by omitting Wren's name from every list on which a name might have brought a small comfort. From further off, past the arch, the crunch of gravel under a booted foot, unhurried, deliberate, and belonging to a person whose steps did not need to hurry because the world hurried toward them instead. She heard, without lifting her head, the yard rearrange itself around that sound. Talk did not stop. It thinned, which is a different thing and a more revealing thing. Postures straightened. A laugh cut off mid-word, its owner blinking as if surprised to find his own mouth had known before he did. A groom who had been leaning on a broom stood the broom upright as though it had personally offended him. And Josiah Blunt, whose voice had a moment ago filled the yard, adjusted his cuffs and became, quite suddenly, a man who had never raised his voice in his life. Wren did not turn to look. She finished tying the poultice with the small square knot her father had taught her, patted the mare's flank once, murmured the useless, kind syllables one murmurs to a horse who does not, in fact, require them, and rose. Only then, only because the mare shifted and she had to step back to give the animal her head, did Wren see the man who had come into the yard. He stood beneath the arch with his gloves in one hand and his other hand resting, without weight, upon the withers of a dark bay hunter that a groom held for him at a nervous distance. He was tall, and he was not young in the way that the head groom had implied by calling him the new Duke, though he was certainly younger than the old one had been at his death. He had the kind of face that a painter would have painted in 3/4 and no more, because a full-face view would have insisted upon a symmetry that his eyes, deep-set and unreadable, refused to give. His coat was dark, cut close, unornamented. His boots were plain and beautifully kept. He wore no ring, No watch chain, no ornament of any kind save a small enamel pin at his collar in the exact gray of a winter sky. And everything about him, from the still hand upon the hunter's withers to the level angle of his shoulders, spoke of a man who had learned early that a room would arrange itself around him whether he willed it or not, and had decided some time ago to spare the room the effort. This was Alaric Vane, 6th Duke of Ravenhold, returned 3 weeks ago from a campaign in a country whose name the Yard had not troubled to memorize. And Wren, who had glimpsed him twice from a doorway and once from behind a hedge, was seeing him properly for the first time. He did not, at first, appear to see her. He was looking at the head groom, and the head groom, whose color had risen a shade under his weathering, was explaining, with the studied ease of a man who has never in his life been at ease under his master's eye, that all was in hand, that the black stallion had been settled after the night's disturbance, that the animal was, as his grace no doubt understood, of a temper that required a firm hand and time. "Time," said the Duke. His voice was quiet. It was the sort of quiet that does not need to be raised because a room has already lowered itself around it. "How much time, Mr. Blunt?" "As much as an animal of that quality requires, Your Grace." "An interesting answer," said the Duke, and the narrator of the Yard's inner life, had there been one, would have named the small, dry twist at the corner of his mouth as the flicker of an amusement he had not meant to show. His standing licensed the dryness. In another man it would have been insolence. In him it was merely observation. And the Yard, which had been listening with the whole of its face, laughed the small, careful laugh of listeners who have not been given quite enough license to laugh out loud. Not universal. Enough. "The animal was my father's last purchase," the Duke went on, in the same low tone. "I would prefer that his last purchase were not also his last mistake. Bring him out." A silence. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of men calculating whose fault it would be if the thing that was about to happen went badly. Josiah Blunt inclined his head with a smoothness that had cost him years to acquire, and gave the order to a boy, and the boy went, and the Yard, which had begun to breathe again, held its breath a second time. The stallion came out of the far wing at the end of a lead rope held by 2 men, and looking, even at a distance, as though he considered the rope a personal affront. He was a great black horse, 16 hands and a fraction more, with the deep quarters and the light head of an animal bred for speed and refined further for temper. And he came out of the shadow of the archway into the pale March light, with his ears back and his nostrils wide, and the whites of his eyes showing in a way that made the boy nearest his shoulder step, without shame, half a pace behind the man on the other side. His coat was the black that is almost blue where the sun touches it. On his near foreleg, low, a single white sock like a bandage the horse had put on himself. He came 3 paces into the Yard and stopped, and neither of the men at his head could persuade him to come a 4th. "His Grace is black," murmured a groom near Wren, in the tone one reserves for weather one cannot influence. Wren, who had seen the black 3 times since his arrival, and had not yet been permitted within 10 feet of him, watched him now with the quiet attention she gave to any animal that had been misread by the room around it. Ears back, yes. Whites of the eyes, yes. Nostrils wide. But the ears were not pinned flat, and the whites were the whites of a horse who had been startled and had not yet been given a reason to stop being startled. And the wide nostrils were reading, not warning. He was not, she thought, a savage horse. He was a frightened one whom no one had troubled to unfrighten, and the difference between the two was the difference between a life and a death. And no one in the Yard, from Mr. Blunt to the boy at the halter, appeared to know it. She did not say so. She had, 6 years ago, said such things. She had learned. She stood by the mare's box with her red-knuckled hands folded before her apron and her face composed into the small, useful blank of a stable girl who has been told, by long experience, that her opinion was not the coin the yard accepted. Do the small things well. She kept her eyes on the black. The Duke crossed the yard without hurry. The stallion's head came up. The two men at his halter tightened their grip on the rope in the reflexive way of men who expect a thing to go wrong. The Duke stopped an arm's length from the horse's shoulder, and did not raise a hand, and did not speak, and simply stood. And after a long moment, the stallion, without lowering his head, without softening his eye, flicked one ear forward the width of a coin, and flicked it back. "He does not care for you either, Your Grace," said Josiah Blunt, with a small laugh calibrated to invite a matching laugh from his master. There was no matching laugh. The Duke's eyes, still on the stallion, did not move. "He does not know me yet, Mr. Blunt." Wren, watching, felt something inside her chest give a small, involuntary lift, the way a curtain lifts when a window opens in another room. It was not admiration, not yet. It was recognition of a kind of speech she had not expected to hear in this yard from this man, and she filed it away, silently, in the private ledger where she kept every observation she was not permitted to share. "Take him back," said the Duke, and the two men, with visible relief, turned the stallion in a tight, resisting circle and led him away. And the black went with them because he was tired of the rope, not because he had consented. And Wren saw the difference and knew that she was probably the only person in the yard who did. The Duke turned. His eyes, moving across the yard the way a level moves across a wall, passed over the grooms, passed over the housekeeper's boy who had lingered too long in a doorway and was even now scuttling away, passed over the mare in her box, and the poultice on her hock, and the girl standing beside her with her hands folded, and did not precisely stop. But they slowed. For the space of a breath, no longer, his gaze rested upon the poultice, and then upon the small, square knot with which it had been tied, and then upon the hands that were folded above the apron in the exact attitude of a person who had done a piece of work and did not intend to be thanked for it. Then he looked away. He said something to Josiah Blunt that Wren did not hear. He drew on his gloves. He mounted the dark bay hunter with the economy of a man who had mounted horses in weathers she could not imagine. And he rode out under the arch at a walk, and the yard, released, exhaled the held breath it had not admitted to holding, and Josiah Blunt turned upon the nearest groom with a sudden brightness of manner and began to give orders about the exercise string. He did not look at Wren. She did not look at him. She unfolded her hands, took up her bucket, and went to fetch fresh water for the mare. And if her heart was beating a shade faster than the poultice work had earned, no one in the yard remarked upon it, because no one in the yard, from long habit, remarked upon her at all. It was familiar. That too was familiar. By the following afternoon, the small, useful story that a duke had ridden into the yard and departed again without incident had been retold in the servants' hall in 6 different versions, and in 5 of them Josiah Blunt had said something admirably wry to his grace, and in the 6th he had said something admirably firm, and in none of them had a girl called Ashford stood beside a mare with her hands folded, and been, for the space of a breath, looked at. Wren ate her bread and cheese at the long table with the other outdoor servants and said nothing. And Kitty, the under-housemaid whose freckled face and easy warmth were the nearest thing Wren had to a friend in the house, leaned toward her under cover of the general talk and said, with the low, teasing perceptiveness that was Kitty's whole gift, "You saw him proper this time, didn't you?" "I saw a horse," said Wren. "You saw him," said Kitty, and grinned, and did not push, and turned to answer the cook about something else, because Kitty was a girl who named the truth, and then walked on and left the truth to do its own work. Wren looked down at her bread, It was good bread. It was, in fact, the same bread the family took upstairs. And if she had been asked at that moment whether she was happy, she would have said, quite honestly, that she had a full plate and dry boots and a mare in the third box whose hock was cooling nicely under her poultice, and that these were, by any measure she was permitted, the ingredients of a fortunate day. She would not have mentioned the small private lift beneath her ribs when a quiet voice in a cold yard had said, "He does not know me yet." She would not have mentioned it because she did not have a word for it, and because, in the language of the household in which she lived, the word, whatever it was, would have been the wrong one. That evening she went back to the tack room because the new Duke's hunter's tack did want doing over, and because Josiah Blunt would find some other unpleasantness for her if it were not done by morning, and because the tack room, at that hour, was the only room in Ravenhold that belonged, for as long as she was in it, entirely to her. The lamp burned low over the bench. The saddle, a working hunting saddle of dark leather with a plain tree and no ornament, lay across the trestle where the boy had left it, and Wren, who had learned saddle work from her father, before her father had been anything but a parson with a fondness for other people's horses, sat down to it with the small private smile she wore only when no one was watching. She oiled the flaps with a rag that smelled of her own hands. She checked the girth straps. She found, running her thumb along the underside of the near side flap, a stitched seam that had begun to go. 3 stitches loose where the leather had rubbed a boot for years and years. And she took her mother's wax thread from the little tin she kept in her apron pocket, and she mended the seam with the same small, close stitch that had once mended a plow rein and a churchyard glove, and no one saw. That, too, was familiar. When she had finished, she set the saddle back upon its rack and stood in the doorway of the tack room with her hand upon the plain snaffle bridle her father had mended, and she looked out across the dark yard at the far wing where the black stallion, unquiet, was pacing the length of his box and, from the sound of it, kicking, at intervals, the boards. She listened. He was not, she thought again, angry. He was frightened, and he had been frightened for so long that the yard had begun to call his fear his temper, and the yard was going to keep calling it that until the fear killed him, or killed a boy. And either way the yard would say, afterwards, that the horse had been savage from the day of his purchase and could not have been saved. She did not go to him. She had been ordered, twice in 3 weeks, not to. She turned down the lamp, closed the tack room door, and went to her narrow bed above the loft, and she lay a long time listening to the black stallion pace, and she thought about her mother's voice, quiet, at a window with a mended sleeve. Do the small things well, and the large things will not be able to overlook you. It did not, on that night, feel like a promise. It felt like a hope she had inherited without being consulted, and she carried it as one carries a hope, gently and without expecting it to be paid. The following morning arrived beneath a low, iron-colored sky, and with it, along the drive under the arch, came a carriage that the yard had been braced for since Mrs. Halbrook had let fall, at supper the previous evening, the words "the Lady Sybil at last." Wren, crossing the yard with a bucket, saw the carriage before she saw its occupant, and she saw the carriage in the way she saw most vehicles, which was through the eyes of the coachman on the box and the pair between the shafts, and both told her, at once and without ornament, that the coachman was a nervous man in a great hurry, and the pair had been driven the last 2 miles at a rate they had not deserved. She stepped aside as the wheels went past, and she looked, as she always looked, at the horses first, and she saw the near-side mare's mouth working against a bit that had been buckled a hole too tight, and she filed it away in the private ledger, and only then did she look up. The Lady Sybil Merivale, cousin to the Duke of Ravenhold by his mother's side, and, according to the servants' hall, the person whom the late Duke had told his son, on his deathbed, that a man in his position must consider, descended from the carriage with the small, practiced laugh of a woman who has been descending from carriages under other people's eyes since the age of 12. She was beautiful. There was no arguing it. She was tall, fair, exquisitely dressed in the traveling gown of deep rose that made the March light around her look, by comparison, apologetic. Her voice, when she spoke to the footman who handed her down, was warm and clear and pitched exactly at the volume that carries kindly to servants, and further, without seeming to any man of standing within 30 feet. "How prettily kept," she said, looking across the yard, and her eyes, moving as the Duke's had moved, passed lightly over the buckets and the boys and the swept cobbles, and did not exactly stop at Wren, and did not exactly refuse to stop. They stopped at Wren's apron. "Oh," she said and laughed. "How useful." It was a compliment. It was, on the surface, a compliment. The words sounded affectionate. The pressure underneath them was not. Wren, who had been carrying the bucket toward the pump, curtsied without setting down the bucket and said, "My lady," in the small, even voice she reserved for the words that did not require her to have a face, and she did not look up, because Lady Sybil, who had been reading rooms since the age of 12, would have read her face inside a second, and Wren was not, this morning, prepared to be read. Lady Sybil laughed again, a small silver laugh that reached the footman and the housekeeper's boy, and, precisely, the head groom, who had appeared under the arch with the air of a man who had heard the wheels from 3 fields away. "Mr. Blunt," she called warmly, "good morning to you. I hope you are keeping our poor cousin's stables in the manner they deserve. He is so exacting, you know." "As his grace requires, my lady," said Josiah Blunt, and he bowed the small, deliberate bow of a man who had bowed to a great many ladies over the course of a career, and had learned exactly the angle beyond which a bow becomes an admission. "And I see," said Lady Sybil with the same warmth, "that you have a girl about the yard. How very modern of you." Her eyes, upon Wren, were the calm interest one might give a small creature crossing a polished surface. "Ashford, my lady," said Josiah Blunt. "Parson's orphan. His Grace's father took her in. Useful, in a way." Useful, that word again. Set off, this time, as its own small beat between 2 other sentences, the way one sets a coin upon a table between 2 hands. Wren did not lift her head. She curtsied a second time to the lady, and a slighter half-bow to the head groom whose word had disposed of her, and stepped aside with her bucket, and Lady Sybil, without another glance, moved on toward the house on the arm of the footman, and Josiah Blunt, in her wake, cast a look at Wren that was not precisely triumphant, and did not precisely need to be. It was familiar. That, too. She fetched her water. She carried it back across the yard. She did not permit herself, until she was inside the tack room, and had set the bucket down beside the bench, and had turned to close the door behind her, to place her hand, briefly, upon the brow band of her father's mended bridle, where the 3 small letters EAW were stitched along the underside, where only a person turning it inward could ever find them. She turned it inward. She looked at the letters. She thought of her mother's voice at the window. "Do the small things well, and the large things will not be able to overlook you." Not today, she thought. Not today, and perhaps not ever. And it did not, this morning, hurt as much as she had feared it would, because a quiet voice in a cold yard had said, the day before, "He does not know me yet." And she had learned, from 6 years of small things done well, to make a great deal out of very little. She hung the bridle back upon its peg. She smoothed her apron. She went out into the yard to do the next thing, because in a stable there is always a next thing. And by evening the entire group in the servants' hall had heard, in 6 different versions, that Lady Sybil had called the parson's girl useful, and that Mr. Blunt had agreed. And in none of the versions had a girl called Ashford stood in a tack-room doorway, with her hand upon 3 small letters stitched in her mother's waxed thread, and decided, without permitting herself to know she had decided, that whatever the yard would call her, she would be, quietly, more. Sometime later, in the small blue hour after supper when the outdoor servants were permitted to sit upon the bench outside the harness room and take the air, Kitty came out of the scullery door with 2 mugs of the housekeeper's second-best tea and sat down beside Wren without asking, and pressed 1 mug into her hand and said without preamble, "She called you useful." "She did," said Wren. "So did he," said Kitty. "So he did," said Wren. "You didn't blink," said Kitty. "I didn't." "That's a talent," said Kitty. "It's a habit," said Wren. And Kitty, whose gift was to name a thing and walk on, snorted into her tea and did not push. They sat in the blue air. Somewhere in the far wing, the black stallion kicked twice against his boards and stopped, and after a little while began to pace. Kitty listened. "He'll kill someone," she said mildly. "He'll kill himself first," said Wren, before she could stop the words. And Kitty turned her freckled face and looked at her with the small perceptive stillness that was her whole gift, and did not say anything for a moment, and then said, "You'd know, wouldn't you?" "I've watched him." "Have you now?" "From here," said Wren, indicating the bench with the mug, "and from the tack room door. I'm not to go near him. Mr. Blunt was very clear." "Mr. Blunt is very clear about a great many things," said Kitty dryly. "The Duke was clear too." "Was he?" said Kitty. "He was." A silence. In the far wing the pacing settled, briefly, and then began again. Kitty watched the archway for a moment, as though the archway might answer a question she had not asked, and then she said, without looking at Wren, "You know they'll marry her." Wren drank her tea. "Everyone says so," said Kitty. "It was the old Duke's dying wish, so they say, and the family have been throwing them together since he was a boy of 12. And she's the sort of woman a man of his standing is supposed to want, and he is a man of his standing." "Yes," said Wren. "Yes, what?" said Kitty. "Yes, everyone says so." "You didn't say yes to any of the other bits." "No." Kitty grinned into her mug. "You're a piece of work, Wren Ashford." "I'm a stable girl," said Wren. "You're a piece of work who is a stable girl," said Kitty, and drank her tea, and did not for once ask further. The blue air deepened toward night. In the great house a window kindled, warm, above the terrace, and Wren saw through it the small distant figure of Lady Sybil crossing the drawing room on the arm of the housekeeper, and she saw, standing before the fire, a taller figure in dark clothes who did not turn to greet the lady, but inclined his head, once, and gestured her to a chair. The window gave nothing more. The curtains were drawn a moment later by an unseen hand. Wren looked away, because she had been looking a beat longer than she would have permitted herself under any other roof, and she found Kitty watching her, and Kitty said nothing at all, which was, from Kitty, a whole sentence. "I'm to bed," said Wren, rising. "Bridal wants doing over in the morning." "Which bridal?" "The Hunter's." "You did the Hunter's tack yesterday." "I'll do it again," said Wren. "The strap I mended wants checking." Kitty considered her, and Kitty's face, under the blue light, was suddenly older than her 22 years. "Wren," she said. "Yes?" "If he ever looks at you proper, you tell me." "He won't." "If he ever does," said Kitty quietly, "you tell me, because they will make you pay for it, and I want to be ready to stand next to you when they do." Wren opened her mouth to say something dismissive, and did not, because Kitty had named a thing, and Kitty's gift was to name a thing and walk on. And Wren had learned over 6 years that when Kitty named a thing, it was worth listening to. She nodded once. She took the empty mugs. She went inside. That night, in her narrow bed above the loft, she lay awake a long time. The black stallion paced. The wind moved along the eaves. Somewhere below her, a boy laughed in his sleep. She thought about a quiet voice in a cold yard. She thought about a woman's silver laugh and a coachman's tight rein, and a mare's mouth working against a bit buckled a hole too tight. And she thought about her mother's mended sleeve at a window. And she thought about the 3 small letters stitched inside a brow band, where only a person turning it inward could ever find them. And she did not, at any point, permit herself to name the small, private lift beneath her ribs that had first stirred in a cold yard, and had not, since, gone entirely still. She turned onto her side. She closed her eyes. She said, in the smallest interior voice she had, the sentence her mother had left her, not because she believed it tonight, but because she had said it every night for 7 years, and the saying had become its own small comfort. Do the small things well. She slept. By the following morning, the yard was already awake when she came down the loft ladder, because a great house that expects its master to ride out at first light is a house that has been awake since 2 hours before first light. And Wren, who had risen without needing to be called, took her place at the pump and drew water and carried it, and did not, for the first hour, look toward the far wing at all. She was, in this, disciplined. She had been ordered not to go near the black. She did not go near the black. She did the small things well. She poulticed the mare's hock a second time and found the swelling markedly reduced. She oiled a second bridle. She swept a stretch of cobble that had not, strictly, been assigned to her, because a swept cobble was a swept cobble, and Josiah Blunt, who could find fault with a great many things, had not yet, in 6 years, found fault with a swept cobble. And when, at the end of the first hour, the yard bell rang and the exercise string was let out and the head groom's back was turned, she permitted herself, at last, to walk the length of the arcade to the far wing and stand, just for a moment, at the door of the black stallion's box, and to look at him. He was standing at the back of his box, with his head down and his ears half back, and he was sweating faintly along the neck. And the sweat was the sweat of an animal who had spent a night pacing and had not yet been rewarded for stopping. And the straw beneath him was churned in a pattern Wren recognized at once as the pattern of a horse who circled to the left because circling to the right hurt him. She did not enter the box. She stood at the door with her hands folded before her apron, in the small, useful attitude she had learned, and she looked at him. And after a long moment, the black stallion, without lifting his head, without softening his eye, flicked one ear forward the width of a coin, and flicked it back. It was, exactly, the gesture he had given the Duke. Wren stood very still. She did not speak. She did not move her hands. She only breathed, slowly, in the slow, measured way her father had taught her to breathe near a startled colt. And after a moment, because the horse was not, in fact, a savage horse, he lifted his head half an inch and looked at her, once, out of the corner of a dark eye, and then dropped his head again, and did not, this time, lay his ears back at all. She did not smile. She did not permit herself to smile, because a smile was a coin, and she did not yet know whether he would accept it. She stood at the door of his box for the time it took to say, once, under her breath, the sentence her mother had left her. And then she stepped back and returned along the arcade the way she had come, and she did not look toward the yard, because she did not need to look, because she had heard, over the small, ordinary sounds of the morning, the crunch of a booted foot on the gravel of the drive beyond the arch, unhurried, deliberate, and belonging to a person whose steps did not need to hurry. And when she reached the tack room and turned to close the door behind her, she looked, without meaning to, back along the arcade, and she saw, standing under the arch with his gloves in one hand and his other hand resting upon nothing at all, the Duke of Ravenhold, who was not looking at the yard, and was not looking at the head groom, and was not looking at the far wing where his father's last purchase had, for the first time in 3 weeks, stopped pacing. He was looking, quite steadily, at her. She did not, this time, permit herself to look away first. It would have been the correct thing, the small survival, the servant's habitual lowering of the eye that had, over 6 years, kept her out of a great many rooms whose disapproval she could not have afforded. She knew the movement. She had made it 1,000 times. But she found, standing in the tack room doorway with her hand still upon the latch and the arcade running long and cold between them, that her body had, without consulting her, decided otherwise. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them, for the space of 3 breaths, gave the other the small courtesy of releasing the look, and the yard, which was busy, and the wind, which had risen along the eaves, and Josiah Blunt, who was somewhere out of sight at the pump, giving an order in a voice pitched for anyone who might be listening, all of them continued to exist, and none of them, for those 3 breaths, mattered. Then the Duke, without hurry, inclined his head. It was the smallest gesture, not a bow, not by any measure the yard could have named, a greeting. It was the movement a man makes when he acknowledges, privately and to himself, that a thing he suspected has been confirmed. And Wren, who had grown up reading horses and had learned since then to read men by the same grammar, understood it exactly. She curtsied. She curtsied because a curtsy was the coin the yard accepted, and because a curtsy, correctly performed, was a costume behind which one could hide a great deal. And she performed hers with the correct depth for a stable girl to a duke, and not one thread of expression more. And when she rose, he had already turned and was walking, unhurried, toward the far wing where his father's last purchase stood at the back of his box with his head down. She closed the tack room door behind her. She stood inside it a moment, with her palm flat against the wood. Her heart, which had spent 6 years at the pace of a swept cobble, was performing a small, disorderly rhythm she did not entirely recognize, and she set her palm harder against the wood, as though pressure might steady it. And after a moment, it did, because she had a great deal of practice at pressing steadiness into places that did not, on their own, wish to have it. "Do the small things well," she said, inside her head, in her mother's voice at the window. And she took her hand away from the door, and she went to the bench, and she oiled the second bridle, and she did not permit herself to think, for the length of a bridle, about anything else. It was, however, a very short bridle. By evening, the entire group of outdoor servants had heard, in 5 different versions, that the new Duke had walked the length of the far wing that morning and had stood a full 10 minutes at the door of the black stallion's box, and had said nothing to the head groom about what he had seen there, which was, in Josiah Blunt's practiced reading of Josiah Blunt's own master, worse than if he had said a great deal. In none of the 5 versions was a girl called Ashford mentioned. In one of them, a boy who had been carrying a barrow across the arcade said that the horse had, for the first time in 3 weeks, been standing quiet. In another, an older groom said that a quiet horse before a duke was more dangerous than a loud one, because a quiet horse was a horse who had been waiting for someone. Neither remark traveled further than the servants' hall, because the housekeeper's boy, who was the yard's usual conduit upward, was that evening occupied in setting out a decanter of the second-best claret for Lady Sybil Merivale, who had asked prettily whether his grace might join her before dinner, and had been answered prettily that his grace was engaged upon estate business and would join her at the table. She had smiled at the answer. She had, Wren gathered from Kitty, gone on smiling for the rest of the afternoon, in the small, sustained way of a woman who has learned that a sustained smile is itself a form of correction. By the following morning, her correction had, by whatever channel such corrections travel, arrived in the yard. It arrived in the form of a note delivered by the housekeeper's boy to Josiah Blunt at the pump, and Josiah Blunt read it and folded it once and put it inside his waistcoat and turned upon the yard with the expression of a man who had just been handed, unexpectedly, a knife he had been waiting 6 years to use. Ashford. Yes, Mr. Blunt? You will not, he said, in the loud, pleasant voice he used when he wished the yard to overhear a private discipline. You will not, for any reason whatsoever, be seen near the Black Horse. Her ladyship has expressed a concern for the safety of the household. She is quite right. The animal is not a fit responsibility for a girl. You will confine yourself to the mare's wing and the pump, and you will not cross the arcade beyond the 4th box without my direct order. And if you are seen at the door of that box again, by me or by any man in this yard, you will find yourself walking to the village by nightfall. Am I understood? Yes, Mr. Blunt. Say it back to me, girl. I am not to cross the arcade beyond the 4th box without your direct order, Mr. Blunt. And I am not to be seen at the door of the Stallion's box. Very good. A silence. The yard, which had been busy, was not busy. Every man in it had heard, and every man in it was pretending, with the practiced innocence of men in a yard, to be occupied with something else. And Josiah Blunt, who understood his audience exactly, permitted the silence to sit an extra beat before he released it with a small, dismissive lift of his chin. Get on, then. She got on. She fetched water. She swept a stretch of cobble. She did not, at any point, look toward the far wing. She did not permit herself to look, because to look would have been to give Josiah Blunt the coin of a reaction, and satisfaction, she had decided long ago, was a coin she did not owe him. Inside her chest, however, there was a small, still, cold place that had opened at the words, "Her ladyship has expressed a concern," and that had not, by the end of the morning, closed. It was not fear. It was the older, quieter thing that lives beneath fear in a person who has been undervalued for a very long time, and has learned to recognize the shape of a hand reaching for a knife. She thought about it, without letting her face show she was thinking. She thought about it while she carried the water, and while she oiled the 4th bridle of the week, and while she poulticed the mare a 3rd time, and by the time the bell rang for the servants' dinner, she had understood 2 things about it. The first was that Lady Sybil Merivale, whom she had met once for the space of 6 sentences, had noticed her enough to have her removed from an arcade. And Lady Sybil Merivale did not, on the evidence of a coachman's tight rein and a bit buckled a hole too tight, notice anyone she had not first decided to correct. The second was that the note in Josiah Blunt's waistcoat had not, on the wording of his loud, pleasant voice, mentioned a girl at all. It had mentioned a household. The girl was Josiah Blunt's own contribution, and Josiah Blunt was a man who did not add contributions of his own without the assurance, from somewhere, that his contributions would be welcome. She ate her bread. She said nothing. Kitty, across the table, watched her over the rim of a mug and did not say anything either, which was, from Kitty, a whole sentence. After dinner, she went to the tack room, because the tack room was, at that hour, still the only room in Ravenhold that belonged, for as long as she was in it, entirely to her. And she took the plain snaffle bridle her father had mended from its peg, and she turned it inward, and she looked at the 3 small letters stitched along the underside where only a person turning it inward could ever find them, and she said, in the smallest interior voice she had, "Do the small things well." And she was aware, as she said it, that the sentence had begun, for the first time in 7 years, to feel not like a hope, but like an instruction. She hung the bridle back upon its peg. She smoothed her apron. She went out into the yard. She did not cross the arcade beyond the 4th box. She had been ordered not to. she did not need to.
She stood at the pump, which was permitted, and she drew water, which was permitted. And while she drew, she looked, with the peripheral attention that a stable girl learns before she learns her letters, at the door of the far wing where the black stallion, unseen behind his boards, had begun again to pace. She did not go to him, but she stood at the pump a little longer than the water strictly required, and she said inside her head, a slow, measured breath in the pattern her father had taught her, and after a little while, because the wing was long and the boards were old and sound carried, the pacing settled, briefly, and then began again, and she took her bucket and went back across the yard, and she did not, at any point, look toward the arch. It was 2 days later, in the small blue hour before supper, that the Duke came a second time into the tack room. She did not know it was him until he had crossed the threshold, because he moved, as she had already learned, with the quiet of a man whose steps did not need to hurry. And she was bent over the bench with her hands full of a length of new rain and her mind entirely upon the stitch she was setting. And she looked up, because a shadow had fallen across the leather, and she saw him standing just inside the door with his gloves in one hand and the other hand at his side, and no ornament upon him save the small enamel pin at his collar in the exact gray of a winter sky. She rose. She curtsied. She said, "Your Grace," in the small, even voice she reserved for the words that did not require her to have a face, and she did not look up, because there were rules for a girl alone in a room with a duke, and she had been raised by a parson and knew all of them. "Sit down, Miss Ashford." She sat, because she had been told to, and because the small formal miss was the sort of word a duke used to a governess and not to a stable girl. And Wren was too disciplined a listener to miss a word placed with that particular care. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes upon the length of rain, and she waited. He did not at once speak. He stood inside the door, and he looked, without hurry, along the walls of the tack room, at the bridles hung in their neat rows, at the saddles on their trees, at the shelf of tins and the bottle of neatsfoot oil, and the small square of clean rag folded upon the bench beside her elbow. And she watched him without seeming to, and understood, from the level angle of his shoulders and the small, unhurried movement of his eye, that he was reading the room the way she had, 2 mornings ago, read the churned pattern of straw in the stallion's box. He was reading it for the person who kept it, who mended the near side flap on the hunter's saddle. She had not been asked a question in that tone by anyone in the yard for 6 years, and she felt the small, involuntary lift beneath her ribs that she had not, since a cold yard, allowed herself to name. She kept her eyes on the rain. "I did, Your Grace." "With what thread?" "Laxed linen thread, Your Grace, my mother's." A short silence. "Your mother's?" "Yes, Your Grace." "It is a good stitch," he said, in the same quiet voice. "It is the stitch a saddler uses on a rein he expects to be pulled hard, not a stable girl stitch." "My father was a parson, Your Grace. He kept his own tack. He taught me." "Your father was a parson," he repeated, and the small, dry twist at the corner of his mouth that she had seen once in a cold yard was there again, and gone. "And who taught your father?" "A saddler at Ely, Your Grace, before he took orders." "I see." Another silence. He had not moved from the door. He had not, at any point, come further into the room, and Wren understood, without needing to be told, that he was standing where he was standing because a duke in a tack room with a stable girl and the door open was one thing, and a duke in a tack room with a stable girl and the door closed was another. And he had chosen, deliberately, the first. It was a small courtesy. It was not a courtesy she had expected. She filed it, silently, in the private ledger. "The black holes," he said. She looked up, once, before she could stop herself. His eyes were on the bridle above her head, not on her. She looked back at the rain.
Yes, Your Grace.
You have been ordered not to go near him.
Yes, Your Grace.
By Mr. Blunt.
Yes, Your Grace.
At whose instruction?
She did not answer at once. She weighed the answer in the small, careful scales she had been using for 6 years to weigh what a person in her position was permitted to say to a person in his. And she found, to her own faint surprise, that the scales tipped a different way today than they would have tipped a week ago. I could not say, Your Grace.
You could not say, he repeated, without inflection. Or you will not?
I will not, Your Grace. The small, dry twist again.
Thank you, he said. That was the answer I wanted.
He did not move. He did not, quite yet, leave. He was looking now at the plain snaffle bridle her father had mended, hanging on its peg above her bench, and she watched him, without turning her head, and she saw the moment his eye caught on the brow band and the small movement of his hand toward it, that he did not, in the end, complete. He did not touch the bridle. He did not ask about it, he said in the same quiet voice. He was standing still at the door of his box when I came into the arcade 3 mornings ago. Yes, Your Grace. He has not stood still for anyone in this yard in 3 weeks. No, Your Grace. You will confine yourself to your orders, Miss Ashford. Yes, Your Grace. But if, he said, and stopped, and it was the first small hesitation she had heard from him, and it lasted only the length of a breath, and then he went on. But if the animal, at any hour of the day or night, requires a poultice, or a fresh straw, or the correction of a bit buckled a hole too tight, and you are the only person in the yard able to perform the work, you will perform it. You will not consult Mr. Blunt. You will not ask permission. You will do the work, and you will inform me afterwards, and I will speak to Mr. Blunt. She lifted her head this time and looked at him. He was already turning to go. He inclined his head, once, in the same small private gesture with which he had, 3 mornings ago, acknowledged a confirmed suspicion across a cold yard, and he went out into the arcade and closed the door behind him with the same unhurried courtesy with which he had opened it. And Wren sat alone at the bench, with her hands upon a length of new rein and a stitch half set. And she understood, at last, and without permitting herself to smile, that a quiet voice had said to her, in as many words as the language of a great house would allow, I have seen you. She did not smile. She finished the stitch. She hung the rein upon its peg. She smoothed her apron. She went out into the yard and drew water, and she did not, at any point, look toward the far wing. She had been ordered not to. She had also, this afternoon, been given a private permission that overrode the order, and she carried both, held them in balance, and did not permit her face to advertise either. It was familiar. That, too, was familiar. By evening, the household was preparing for what Kitty, dropping into the bench beside her with 2 mugs of tea, called the first proper dinner of the new reign. Lady Sybil had summoned, by way of the housekeeper, a party of neighbors from 3 great houses within riding distance, and the neighbors would arrive by the following afternoon, and by the following evening the drawing-room would be full of people whose business, as Kitty put it, was to look at the new Duke, and to look at the lady beside him and to decide, on the strength of the looking, whether the county had a duchess or not. And? Said Wren. And nothing, said Kitty. You know what they'll decide. I know what she'll decide. Same thing, said Kitty. In this county, same thing. Wren drank her tea. In the far wing, the black stallion paced. A groom, walking past, said something to another groom about the animal's temper, and the other groom, laughing, said something back about the parson's girl and the door of the box, and Wren heard both remarks and did not turn her head, because a turned head was a coin she did not owe them either. Kitty, however, heard them, and Kitty's freckled face in the blue hour went briefly still. They've noticed. They've been talking about the horse for 3 weeks. They weren't putting your name next to his 3 weeks ago. Wren did not answer. She drank her tea. Kitty watched her a moment and then said in her lowest voice, "Wren." "Yes?" "If she has decided," said Kitty, "then she has decided about you as well. You understand that?" "I understand." "She won't do it herself. She won't have to. She'll only need to say a word to Mr. Blunt, and Mr. Blunt has been waiting to say the word back to her for 6 years." "I know." "Then be careful." "I am always careful." "Be more careful," said Kitty, and she said it not lightly at all. And Wren, who had spent the whole of a week rebuilding the small, still, cold place inside her chest into a shape she could carry, felt, briefly, the walls of that place shift, and settled them again, and nodded once. That night the black stallion paced later than usual. She lay in her narrow bed and listened, and she thought about a quiet voice in a tack room saying, "You will not consult Mr. Blunt." And she thought about her mother's voice at a window saying, "Do the small things well." And she thought about a silver laugh in a rose gown saying, "How useful." And she did not sleep for a long time. And when she slept, it was not deeply. She woke before the bell. She dressed. She came down the loft ladder into a yard already gray with the wet March pre-dawn, and she found, at the door of the far wing, the boy Tom, who was 14 and terrified of the black stallion, standing white-faced with a bucket in his hand and no one in sight. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "He kicked the boards through in the night. There's blood on the near hind. Mr. Blunt isn't up yet. I can't go in. I'm sorry, I can't go in." She did not consult Mr. Blunt. She did not ask permission. She took the bucket from the boy's hand and she said, quietly, "Go to the pump and fetch me warm water in the second bucket, and a clean cloth from the tack room shelf, and the small tin of comfrey salve from the top of the medicine chest. And do not run, and do not speak to anyone. And when Mr. Blunt comes into the yard, you will tell him that His Grace's orders were followed." "His Grace's orders?" said the boy, blinking. "Yes," she said. "Go." He went. She stood at the door of the box a moment with the empty bucket at her feet and her hands folded before her apron, in the small, useful attitude she had learned. And she looked, without moving, at the black stallion. He was standing at the back of his box with his head down. On the near hind, low above the fetlock, a dark wetness that in the gray light might have been shadow and was not. His ears were half back, his nostrils were wide. He was not, she thought again, savage. He was frightened, and now he was frightened and hurting, and the yard in an hour would call it temper, and the yard would be wrong. She spoke to him in the smallest voice she had, in the slow, measured rhythm her father had taught her, the useless, kind syllables one uses to a horse who does not, in fact, require them and is calmed by them anyway. She did not enter the box. She stood at the door, and she breathed the slow breath, and she said nothing that meant anything at all. And after a long moment, the black stallion lifted his head half an inch and looked at her, once, out of the corner of a dark eye, and then dropped his head again, and did not, this time, lay his ears back at all. Tom came back with the water and the cloth and the salve. She thanked him. She sent him to stand at the arch with orders to give her word the moment Mr. Blunt appeared. And she opened the door of the box, and she went in. The black stallion did not move. She spoke as she moved. She did not touch him at first. She set the bucket down at a distance. She stood at his shoulder, not before him, beside him, at the exact angle her father had taught her to stand beside a horse who had been given no reason to trust the last 5 people who had come into his box. And she waited until his breathing changed, one long release along the ribs. And only then did she lay her hand flat upon his neck. He shivered once, along the whole length of him. He did not strike. He did not kick. He turned his head, slowly, and put his muzzle against the front of her apron, and stood. She did the small things well. She washed the cut above the fetlock. She dressed it with the comfrey salve. She checked the near fore and the off hind and the off fore and found no other wound. She spoke to him the whole time in the small, useless voice, and she moved with the slow, measured economy her father had taught her. And when she was done, she stood a moment at his shoulder with her hand upon his neck, and he stood with his muzzle against her apron, and she said, inside her head, in her mother's voice at a window, "Do the small things well." And this morning the sentence was neither a hope nor an instruction. It was, simply, a description of what she was doing. She let herself out of the box. She closed the door. She turned, and she found the Duke of Ravenhold standing 3 paces behind her in the arcade, in his shirt sleeves and a plain riding coat unbuttoned, and his hair damp at the temples from the pre-dawn wet, and his eyes on the cloth in her hand and the dark stain along the edge of it. He had come in without her hearing him. She curtsied. "Your Grace." "How bad?" "A kick against the boards, Your Grace, above the near hind fetlock. Not deep. It has been washed and dressed. He will need the poultice changed at midday and again at nightfall, and he should not be worked for a week. The boards want mending, Your Grace. He kicked them because something startled him in the night. I would like your permission to sit up with him tonight." She said it in one even breath, in the small, even voice, without lifting her eyes above the level of his collar. There was a silence. It was not a long silence. It was, however, an entire silence. And Wren, who had learned to read men by the grammar of horses, understood every fraction of it. He had come out of his house before dawn to see a horse he had already been told, by whatever channel such tellings travel, was hurt. He had come in his shirt sleeves, without his gloves, without any ornament save the plain gray enamel pin at his collar, and he had come at the pace of a man who had not permitted himself to run. He had come, and he had found the animal calm, and the wound dressed, and the girl at the door with a bucket in her hand, and no one else in the arcade, and the small dry twist at the corner of his mouth that she had seen twice now was there again, and gone. "You have my permission, Miss Ashford." "Thank you, Your Grace." "And you will oblige me by informing Mr. Blunt, when he arrives, that these instructions came from me directly, and that any question he has may be brought to me at any hour." "Yes, Your Grace." "Miss Ashford." "Your Grace." "Look at me." She looked at him. His eyes, which she had seen only in profile and only across a yard, were at 3 paces and in the gray pre-dawn light, not, in fact, unreadable. They were gray. They were the exact gray of the small enamel pin at his collar, and they were, for the space of a breath, the eyes of a man and not of a duke. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know," said Wren before she could stop the words, and then, aware of what she had said, added, "Your Grace," and curtsied a second time. He inclined his head. He went. She stood a moment at the door of the box with the cloth still in her hand and the private ledger inside her chest recording every fraction of what had passed. And she did not, this time, forbid herself the small private smile that had, without her permission, arrived. Then she folded the cloth and put it in the bucket and went to meet Josiah Blunt at the arch, because Josiah Blunt was, by now, coming into the yard, and the loud, pleasant voice with which he was going to greet the news of what had happened in his absence was already from the arch audible. He did not raise his voice at her. He did not, in front of the boy Tom and the two grooms who had appeared behind him, permit himself to be less than perfectly correct. He listened. He nodded. He said, in a voice pitched for anyone who might be listening, that he was glad to hear that His Grace's orders had been followed, and that he would, of course, review the arrangements for the night. And he touched his hat to her and dismissed her. And Wren, who had learned to read men by the grammar of horses, understood that Josiah Blunt had that morning, for the first time in 6 years, been afraid of her, and had decided in the same moment that he was not going to forgive her for it. It was familiar. It was not, however, the same. She fetched water. She swept a cobble. She did not look toward the far wing. By the middle of the day, the neighbors had begun to arrive. Wren, at the pump, saw carriages come under the arch and be led away, and she saw a footman handing down a lady in blue, and she saw a gentleman on a chestnut mare and heard the mare's shod feet ring on the cobble, and she noted, without permitting her face to show she had noted, that the mare's off fore was throwing a stone and would, within a mile, throw a shoe. She said so, quietly, to the boy at the mare's head, and the boy, who knew her, took the mare aside and lifted the foot and found the stone, and later, when the gentleman came out and was told, the gentleman looked at Wren for the space of one breath and then looked away, because a stable girl who had saved him a shoe was still, in the reckoning of a great house's guest, a stable girl. It was familiar, that too, and no one saw. That afternoon, Lady Sybil Merivale walked out into the yard on the arm of Lady Marbury, whose blue gown had a shade that the March light did not complement, and she walked out for the purpose of showing Lady Marbury the stables, and the two ladies, moving along the arcade at the pace of women whose gowns did not permit haste, arrived at the door of the Black Stallion's box, and Lady Sybil, whose gift was to notice the correct thing at the correct moment, noticed at once that the stallion was standing quiet with his head down, and the near hind bandaged and a clean bed of straw beneath him. "Oh," she said, "how very odd." "My dear," said Lady Marbury, "the horse, he has been quite a nuisance since our poor Duke's return, and now, you see, he is behaving." "How pleasant. How pleasant indeed," said Lady Sybil, and she permitted her eye to travel along the arcade to where Wren was at that moment carrying a bucket toward the pump, and she said, in the warm, clear voice pitched exactly at the volume that carries kindly to servants and further, without seeming to any man of standing within 30 feet, "Ashford, have you been at that horse?" Wren set the bucket down. She curtsied. "His Grace was kind enough to give me leave to dress a cut on the near hind this morning, my lady." "How useful," said Lady Sybil warmly, and Lady Marbury laughed the small, polite laugh of a woman who had not been told the joke, but did not, in her friend's company, wish to be seen not to have heard one. "And do you find, Ashford," went on Lady Sybil, "that His Grace is easily persuaded to give leave to a stable girl to attend to a horse he has ordered no one to touch?" It was a compliment. It was, on the surface, an inquiry. The words were affectionate. The pressure underneath them was not. Wren kept her eyes on the level of Lady Sybil's third button. "I could not say, my lady." "You could not say," repeated Lady Sybil with the same warmth. "Modest. How useful." She turned to Lady Marbury with the small silver laugh she had used in the drive, and she said, "Modesty in a servant is such a comfort, is it not, my dear?" And Lady Marbury laughed the small, polite laugh again, and the two ladies moved on along the arcade. And Wren picked up the bucket, and she did not permit her face to show anything, and she went to the pump. Kitty was at the scullery door. Kitty had heard. Kitty's freckled face in the March light was not smiling. "Wren?" "Later, Kitty." "Wren?" "Later," She did not, that afternoon, permit herself to think about it. She did the small things well. She poulticed the near hind at midday, and she poulticed it again at nightfall, and she carried the bucket, and she oiled a bridle, and she swept a cobble, and she ate her bread, and she said nothing. And by the time the great house rang for dressing, and the drawing room began to fill with rose and blue and gold gowns, and the low, unhurried voices of gentlemen, she had rebuilt the small, still cold place inside her chest into a shape she could carry. And she went to the far wing to sit up with the black stallion, because she had been given, that morning at dawn, a private permission that overrode a public order, and she intended to make use of it. She sat on a stool inside the box with her back against the boards, and her lantern low, and her mother's mended bridle across her knees, because she had, at the last moment before coming out into the wet, taken it down from its peg and brought it with her, without permitting herself to know why. The stallion stood at his manger with his head down. Twice in the first hour he lifted his head, and twice he lowered it again. And by the second hour he had blown a long release along his ribs, and had cocked one hind and shifted his weight, which was, in the language she had learned from her father, an animal at rest. She sat. She did not sleep. She listened, past the boards, past the arcade, past the yard, to the small, distant sounds of the great house. The last carriage under the arch, the fall of a shutter, a man's laughter along the terrace, a woman's silver laugh pitched at the volume that carries kindly and further. She thought about a rose gown in an archway. She thought about a note in a waistcoat. She thought about a boy at the mare's head, and a stone in a foot, and a gentleman who had looked at her for one breath and then away. She thought about her mother's voice at a window, and about 3 small letters stitched inside a browband where only a person turning it inward could ever find them. And she turned the bridle inward, in the low lantern light, and she looked at them, and she said, in the smallest interior voice she had, "Do the small things well." It was, that night, a description. It was becoming, with each hour, an instruction. It was not yet a promise. She was almost asleep on the stool when she heard the arcade door open. She rose. She set the bridle across the manger. She stood at the door of the box with the lantern low behind her, and she looked out into the arcade. And she saw, coming toward her along the length of it, a single figure with a lantern of his own, and no ornament upon him save the small gray pin at his collar. And she did not, this time, permit herself the small dry surprise that had been her first response to him in a tack room doorway. She had begun, without meaning to expect him. He stopped 3 paces from the door of the box, exactly as he had stopped at dawn. He did not enter. "Miss Ashford." "Your Grace?" "The animal." "Sleeping, Your Grace. He has eaten, he has drunk. The wound is clean." "You have been sitting up?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Since when?" "The bell for supper, Your Grace." He lifted the lantern a fraction. It caught, briefly, the plain snaffle bridle across the manger, and his eye went to it, and did not, this time, look away. "That is not one of my bridles." "No, Your Grace." "It is a working bridle." "It is my father's, Your Grace. He mended it before he died. I have kept it. I use it sometimes on the mares, when a bit is being buckled a hole too tight." She had not meant to add the last clause. She heard herself add it, and she heard, in her own even voice, the small, quiet indictment that had lived inside it for 2 days. And she did not, at once, take it back. He did not, at once, answer. He looked at the bridle. Then he looked at her. Then he said, very quietly, "Miss Ashford, whose coachman drives the near-side mare too tight?" A silence. She weighed the answer in the small, careful scales. This time, they did not tip either way. They stood level, and she stood with them, and she said, "My Lady Sybil Merryvales, Your Grace." He did not move. He did not speak for a full breath. Then he said, in the same quiet voice, "Thank you." He inclined his head. He turned. He went back along the arcade with the lantern low and the pace unhurried. And Wren stood at the door of the box with her hand on the boards and her heart at a rhythm she had by now begun to recognize. And she watched the lantern go under the arch and out of sight. And she said aloud to no one, in the smallest voice she had, "Do the small things well." And the black stallion behind her blew a long release along his ribs, and did not, for the rest of the night, pace. It was in the last cold hour before dawn, 3 days later, that the letter came. It came by hand, without a stamp. It came in an envelope of a heavy cream paper that Wren, at the pump, glimpsed for the length of a breath in the housekeeper's boy's hand as he crossed the yard toward the front of the house, and she noted, without permitting her face to show it, that the seal upon the envelope was black, and that the writing was a woman's, and that the boy who carried it was walking at a pace that had been ordered upon him. She did not know then what it was. She learned by the middle of the morning, because a great house at breakfast is a house of listeners, and the housekeeper's boy had a friend in the scullery, and Kitty was in the scullery, and by the time Wren came in with the second bucket, Kitty had drawn her aside behind the door and told her, in the low, unhurried voice that was Kitty's warning voice, that a letter had been delivered to His Grace at breakfast, and His Grace had read it, and had folded it once, and had put it inside his coat, and had said nothing at all, and had gone out immediately afterwards to the library, and had closed the door, and had rung for Josiah Blunt. "About the horse?" said Wren. "About you," said Kitty. Wren set the bucket down. "Say it." "It is an accusation," said Kitty. "It is a formal accusation, in writing, from someone who has signed it, that you have been meeting His Grace in the tack room after dark, and that you have been given unaccountable access to a horse that has been ordered forbidden to you, and that there are, in the small chest in the room above the loft where you sleep, letters from him in your possession, and a piece of the family jewelry, and money." "There are no letters." "I know." "There is no jewelry." "I know." "There is no money." "I know," said Kitty. "Wren, it doesn't matter what there is. It matters what will be found." Wren stood a moment with her hand upon the wall. The small, still cold place inside her chest, which had spent a week rebuilding itself into a shape she could carry, did not, this time, shift. It settled. It settled, in fact, into the shape of a hand upon a bridle, and she felt it settle, and she said, quietly, "Who wrote the letter, Kitty? It isn't signed by her. No. It is signed by Lady Marbury. The blue gown." "The blue gown," said Kitty, "who has been in this house 4 days and has never crossed the arcade beyond the 4th box, and who has never, in her life, mended a bit, buckled a hole too tight, and who has been writing letters in Lady Sybil's dressing room every evening since she came." "Then it is her." "It is her," said Kitty. "Kitty." "Yes?" "Where is the letter now?" "In His Grace's coat pocket. He has not shown it to anyone. He has not spoken of it. He has only rung for Mr. Blunt, and Mr. Blunt is with him now in the library." Wren picked up the bucket. She walked out into the yard. She did not permit her face to show anything. She went to the pump. She drew water. She carried the water into the mare's wing and set it down inside the 3rd box, and stood a moment with her hand upon the mare's shoulder and her mother's voice at a window inside her head, and she said, aloud, to the mare, in the smallest voice she had, "Do the small things well." And the mare, who was a kind creature and had never asked anything of her, blew a soft breath into her hair. She did not know then what she would do. She only knew that the small, still cold place inside her chest had, at last, taken a shape, and that the shape was not the shape of a stable girl who would walk to the village by nightfall, and that she was, without permitting herself to know she had decided, going to answer this. She left the mare. She went out into the yard. She was crossing toward the tack room when the library window opened, and Josiah Blunt came out at the front of the house with a face composed into a correctness that had cost him effort. And behind him, in the doorway of the library, standing in his shirt sleeves without his coat, with a folded letter open in his hand, was the Duke of Ravenhold. And he looked, once, across the drive, and past the arch, and along the length of the arcade, and he found her at the tack room door, and their eyes met across the wet March morning, and he did not, this time, incline his head. He beckoned her once with 2 fingers, in a gesture so small that no one but she could have seen it, and she understood, at once and without needing to be told, that she was being called to the library, and that the room in which the letter would be answered was not the servants' hall and not the arcade and not the tack room, but the library of the great house, and that she was to come now, and that Josiah Blunt, crossing the drive toward her with a face composed into correctness, had not yet been told. She smoothed her apron. She set her hand briefly upon the brow band of the bridle above her bench, where the 3 small letters were stitched along the underside, and she said, inside her head, "Do the small things well." And this time the sentence was, at last, a promise. She went. She was met at the drive by Josiah Blunt, whose eyes upon her were, for the first time in 6 years, not at all familiar. "His Grace wants you in the library." "Yes, Mr. Blunt." "Ashford." "Yes, Mr. Blunt." "If you have anything you wish to say to me, say it now." "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Blunt." He looked at her a long moment. Then he stood aside and she walked past him, and she went along the drive and up the shallow stone steps and through the front door of a house she had in 6 years never once entered by the front, and she found in the paneled hall, waiting at the foot of the great stair with her hands folded before her rose gown and her small silver laugh already prepared, the Lady Sybil Merivale, and behind her, upon the landing, in a traveling gown of deep gray with a black shawl about her shoulders, and eyes so like the Duke's that Wren, at the first glance, knew at once whose eyes he had inherited, a tall old woman with a stick, who had not, by any word the servants' hall had let fall in a week, been expected. "The Dowager Duchess of Ravenhold," said the old woman from the landing without preamble, and in a voice so dry and so unimpressed by the assembled arrangement below her that Lady Sybil's small silver laugh prepared upon her lips died without ever being uttered. "I have been at Bath. My son wrote me a letter this morning. I have come. Girl, come up." Wren, at the foot of the stair, looked up. Lady Sybil, without turning, kept her face perfectly composed. The library door at the top of the stair stood open, and beyond it, standing at the fire in his shirt sleeves with the folded letter in his hand, and the small gray pin at his collar and the dry twist at the corner of his mouth suppressed into stillness, was the Duke of Ravenhold. He did not speak. He did not need to. Wren set her hand upon the banister and began to climb. She climbed at the pace of a person who has been ordered up a stair by an old woman who is not, in her long practiced life, accustomed to being kept waiting, and she climbed with her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes level with the 3rd step above the one she was on, and she did not, at any point, look down at Lady Sybil Merivale, whose small silver laugh, having died upon her lips, had rearranged itself into a small silver silence, pitched at the volume that carries, without seeming to any man of standing within 30 feet. There were no men of standing in the paneled hall. The audience had been withdrawn. It was, Wren understood, without needing to be told, the first correction Lady Sybil had received in a long time. And she had received it from an old woman on a landing who had not, in 11 years, condescended to travel from Bath in March. Wren reached the landing. She curtsied to the dowager. "Your Grace." "You are Ashford?" "Yes, Your Grace." "The parson at Eastleigh?" "My father, Your Grace." "I met him once," said the dowager, without inflection. "He mended a bridle for my late husband on a wet afternoon, and would not accept payment. My late husband spoke of him afterwards for a week. It is a small thing. It is the sort of small thing my late husband remembered. Come." She turned upon her stick and went, at a pace not slow, along the landing toward the library. And Wren went after her, and neither of them looked back. And at the door of the library the dowager stopped, and Wren stopped a step behind her, and the dowager said, over her shoulder, in the same dry voice, "Alaric, close the door behind us. I will not have this conversation with the whole of Ravenhold at the keyhole." "No, ma'am," said the Duke, and he closed the door behind them, and the small snick of the latch was, in the paneled quiet of the library, a sound with a great deal of finality. The library was long and warm. A fire burned along the far wall. The tall windows, whose curtains had been drawn back, gave upon the wet March lawn and the low iron sky. A single chair was set beside the fire for the dowager, and she went to it, and she sat, and she laid her stick across her knees, and she looked at her son. "Read it to me." He read it. He read it in the same quiet voice he had used at the door of a Stallion's box and in the doorway of a tack room. And he read it without inflection. And the letter was, as Kitty had said, an accusation. And it accused Wren Ashford of what the language of a great house permits itself to accuse a stable girl of, when a stable girl has been seen too often in the company of a duke. And it accused her further of being in possession of letters she had never received, and jewelry she had never touched, and a sum of money she had never held. And it was signed, at the bottom, in the round, careful hand of Lady Marbury, whose blue gown did not complement the March light, and who had spent 4 evenings writing letters in another woman's dressing room. He finished. He folded the letter along its original crease. He did not at once look up. "Well," said the dowager, and drew the word out, and set it down between them upon the hearth like a coin she had decided not to spend. "Well, girl, look at me." Wren looked at her. The dowager's eyes, so like her son's, were the exact gray of a winter sky. She was not smiling. She was not, however, unkind. She was, Wren understood, at once and without needing to be told, the sort of high-status older relative who believed the pain of a person she had already decided to believe in before she requested the evidence, and who supplied, in the meantime, a tart aphoristic authority. "Is any of it true?" "No, Your Grace." "No what?" "No letters, no jewelry, no money. I have not been in this house, Your Grace, except by the back door in 6 years. I have not spoken with His Grace above 4 times, and never behind a closed door. The tack room door has been open every time. The arcade door has been open every time. The Stallion. His Grace gave me leave, in the presence of the stable boy Tom, to dress a cut upon the near hind at dawn on Tuesday, and to sit with the animal on the night following. Beyond that I have not entered the box, and I have not, at any time, been alone with His Grace in any place from which the arcade or the yard could not see us. You have a good memory. I have kept, Your Grace, a private ledger. The dowager permitted herself for the first time the small dry twist at the corner of her mouth that Wren had by now learned to recognize as the household expression, inherited on the mother's side. A ledger. Of what? Of everything that has happened, Your Grace, since the morning 3 weeks ago when His Grace first came into the yard. Times, days, who was present, what was said. I keep it in the tack room, upon the shelf above the neatsfoot oil, in a small tin that was my mother's. Why? Because, Your Grace, I am a parson's orphan in a duke's stable, and I have been called useful by 3 people in a week, and I have learned in the last 6 years that a person in my position is safer if she can, at need, remember. A silence. The fire spoke to itself along the log. The dowager looked at her son. The duke did not look at his mother. He was looking at Wren. He had been looking at her, Wren understood, since the moment she had come into the room, and he had not once looked away. Alaric. Yes, ma'am. The tin. I will fetch it myself. You will not, said the dowager. You will send for the head groom, and you will have him fetch it in the presence of the boy Tom, and you will have him bring it here unopened, and you will open it in this room in the presence of us 3 and Mrs. Holbrook, and no other soul, and you will read whatever is written in it, and then you will burn the letter you hold in your hand upon the fire that is behind me. And then you will send for Lady Marbury, and you will send for the coachman who drives the near-side mare too tight, and you will send, last, for the Lady Sybil Merivale, and you will conduct in this room, in 1 hour, the business of this morning to its end. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Good, said the dowager. Girl, sit down. You have been on your feet since before dawn, and you have been accused before breakfast, and I do not intend to add fainting from tiredness to the day's list of small indignities. Sit. Wren sat. The dowager, without turning, called for Mrs. Holbrook, who came at once and was given her instructions with the same tart precision, and Mrs. Holbrook, whose face had never in Wren's memory expressed anything but disapproval, expressed briefly upon the dowager the exact regard a housekeeper reserves for a lady who has arrived without notice and has already, within 10 minutes, corrected a room. She went. Josiah Blunt was sent for. He came. He stood inside the door with his hat in his hand and his weather-worn face composed into the correctness that had, since dawn, cost him effort. And the dowager, without rising, gave him his instructions in a voice that did not raise itself and did not need to, and Josiah Blunt, who had bowed to a great many ladies in the course of a career, bowed to her the small, deliberate bow of a man who understands, at last, that he has miscalculated the room, and went to fetch a tin. He fetched it. He fetched it in the presence of the boy Tom, and he brought it unopened into the library, and he set it upon the small table at the dowager's elbow. And he stood back, and the Duke opened it, and he took out a small folded book bound in blue cloth, and he read, at the dowager's nod, the entries for the last 3 weeks. He read them in the same quiet voice. He read a Tuesday, and a Wednesday, and a Thursday. He read a note in Josiah Blunt's waistcoat, and a rose gown in an archway, and a mare's mouth working against a bit buckled a hole too tight. He read a boy at the door of a box, and a wound above a fetlock, and a comfrey salve. He read the small, dry entries in a hand that was clear and even and undecorated. And he read, at the end, the entry for the last night. 4 lines. His Grace came at 11 with a lantern, did not enter the box, asked after the animal,
asked whose coachman drove the near-side mare too tight, was told, thanked, went. He closed the book. He set it down beside the tin. "There it is," said the dowager. It was, on the surface, a remark. It was, in the language of the room, a verdict. "The letter," she said. He took it up. He crossed to the fire. He held it a moment above the log, and then, without ceremony, he laid it upon the coals, and the letter caught and curled and blackened and was gone. And Mrs. Holbrook, at the door, permitted her face briefly the ghost of a satisfaction she had not allowed it in 11 years of service. Lady Marbury was sent for. She came in the blue gown, and she was made, without cruelty and without mercy, to explain the impossible dates and the round, careful hand and the 4 evenings in another woman's dressing room. And the dowager, without raising her voice and without permitting the exchange to last a syllable longer than the exchange required, said at the end, "Madam, you will leave this house within the hour. You will not, in your lifetime, be received in it again. You will not correspond with any member of this family. You will consider yourself, from this morning, at liberty to enjoy the company you have chosen, and I will consider myself, from this morning, at liberty to describe it accurately to every hostess of my acquaintance. Good day." Lady Marbury went. She did not, upon going, look at Wren. Wren, in her chair beside the fire, did not at any point permit her face to show anything. She had, she found, no wish to look at Lady Marbury either. She had, in the private ledger, already recorded the round, careful hand, and the ledger was, at last, being read. The coachman was sent for. He came, and he was asked one question about the buckling of a bit and about the miles at which a certain pair had been driven the previous week. And he answered it, and the dowager thanked him and dismissed him, and the Duke, at the fire, made upon the mantel a small note in his own hand that Wren, from where she sat, could not read, and did not need to. Lady Sybil Merivale was sent for last. She came into the library in the rose gown with the small silver laugh already prepared, and the composed smile of a woman who has, in the course of a long-practiced life, been corrected by an old woman upon a landing exactly once. And she was made, at the fire, in the presence of the dowager and the Duke, and Wren Ashford and Mrs. Holbrook, to be told, in the dowager's tart aphoristic voice, that the coachman she employed drove her horses in a manner Ravenhold did not countenance, that the friend she had entertained had written, from her dressing room, a letter of a kind Ravenhold did not tolerate, and that the near neighbor of Ravenhold who had come to the great dinner of the season would be permitted, out of a courtesy the dowager did not entirely feel, to remain until the end of the week, and after that would find, on returning to her own house, that the correspondence between the two houses had been discontinued. "Cousin," said Lady Sybil, and the small silver laugh, for the first time, cracked at the edge. "Yes." "It is a misunderstanding." "It is," said the dowager, "a series of very small things done very badly. I have known your mother 40 years. I will write to her this afternoon. Good day." Lady Sybil went. She went without looking at Wren. She went without looking at the Duke. She went, and the library door closed behind her with the same small snick with which it had closed behind Wren an hour before. And the dowager, without turning, said, "Alaric, take the girl outside. It is stopping raining. Walk her upon the terrace. I do not wish to be present for the next quarter of an hour of your life." "No, ma'am," said the Duke. He came away from the fire. He crossed the library. He opened, himself, the door upon the terrace, and he stepped aside. And Wren, who had, that morning, been called by a duke to the front of a house she had never entered by the front, went out upon the terrace of that house, on the arm he did not offer, and did not need to. And the wet March light, which had been iron all morning, gave, briefly, over the west, a pale bar of clean sky. And along that bar the wind moved once, and dropped, and the rain, which had been steady, thinned. He walked her the length of the terrace without speaking. At the far end, where the balustrade turned toward the lawn, and no window of the great house looked out upon them, he stopped, and turned and looked at her. And she saw in the wet March light that his eyes were, at 3 paces, still the gray of a winter sky, and were, this morning, the eyes of a man and not of a duke. She waited. He said, "I have been trying since Tuesday to find the right hour and the right room in which to say a thing to you, Miss Ashford, and I have discovered this morning that there is no right hour and no right room, and I have decided that I will not, therefore, wait for either." "Your Grace." "Not that." She did not at once understand him. Then she did. She said, "Sir." He almost smiled. He did not quite. He said, "I came home in February to bury my father and to marry my cousin. I came home to a stable I had ridden out of at 17, and to a house that had been arranged around me since I was a boy of 12, and to a horse my father had bought 2 months before he died and had not lived to ride. I came home believing that a man in my position was not permitted to look further than the arrangement, and that the arrangement, which had been made for me, would do." He paused. He was looking past her at the wet lawn and at the pale bar of clean sky over the west. "I came into the yard on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, and I saw a girl standing beside a mare with a poultice upon its hock, and her hands folded above her apron. And I saw the knot with which she had tied the poultice. And I understood, in the way one understands a thing without having a word for it, that I had been looking, since the age of 12, at a great many arrangements and at no persons at all, and that I had, on that morning, for the first time in a great many years, seen a person." He did not look at her. He was still looking at the pale bar of sky. "I came back into the yard the following morning because I could not, in the night, account to myself for the disturbance the knot had caused me. And I found a horse standing quiet at the door of his box for a girl who had not been given leave to be near him. I came into the tack room on the 3rd day to give the leave, in as many words as the language of this house permits, and to give it, if I could, without endangering the girl. And I discovered on the 4th day that I had endangered her by giving it. And I have spent, since Friday, every hour I have not been visibly occupied in the library, composing a letter to my mother at Bath, which she received yesterday afternoon, and answered by coming, at her age, in March, without notice, upon a wet road." He turned his head. He looked at her. "I did not," he said quietly, "know that a woman existed for whom I would write such a letter." Wren did not answer at once. The small, still cold place inside her chest, which had, an hour ago, taken the shape of a hand upon a bridle, did not, at these words, dissolve. It held. She felt it hold. She was, she found, grateful for it. She said in the small, even voice she had used all morning, "Sir, I have since Tuesday been called useful by 3 people in a week, and stray by a 4th. And I have been the subject this morning of a letter written from another woman's dressing room. I have not yet been called anything else. I am not going to be persuaded this afternoon on a terrace into being called a 5th thing
before I have been given time to consider whether it is the thing I wish to be called." He looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "No, you are right. Forgive me. I have said this badly." "You have said it," said Wren, and permitted herself, for the first time in 6 years upon Ravenhold ground, a small, dry twist at the corner of her own mouth. "In the exact manner in which I would have expected a man of your standing to say it. It is not a fault. It is only, this afternoon, not sufficient." "What would be sufficient?" "Time," said Wren, "and a room without an audience, and a day upon which I have not, at breakfast, been accused in a letter, and, sir, a horse that has been out of his box." He did then smile. It was a small smile. It was not permitted to become larger. He said, "I will endeavor, Miss Ashford, to arrange all 4. "Thank you, sir." "May I take you back inside?" "You may walk me to the head of the servants' stair, sir. I will go down it myself." He did. He walked her along the terrace at the pace at which he had walked her out, and at the head of the servants' stair he did not at once let her go. He stood with her upon the little landing, in the half-light that fell from the tall window, and he said in the quietest voice she had heard him use, "Miss Ashford." "Sir." "Whatever you decide, in the end, to permit me to call you, I have already, in my own head, called you a great many things, and none of them, I promise you, has been useful." She did not answer. She did not quite trust her voice. She looked at him a moment, and he looked at her, and then she curtsied, and he inclined his head, and she went down the servants' stair, and she did not permit herself at any step to smile. It was in the small blue hour that evening, upon the bench outside the harness room, that Kitty pressed a mug of the housekeeper's second-best tea into her hand and said, without preamble, "You lived." "I lived." "And the blue gown?" "Gone by 4. "And the rose gown?"
"By the end of the week."
"And you?"
"Here." Kitty drank her tea. In the far wing, the black stallion did not pace. The night was still. Somewhere above the terrace a window kindled, warm, and did not, this time, draw its curtain.
"Wren?"
"Yes."
"It isn't over."
"I know. She'll go home to her mother, and her mother will write, and there will be a season of small unpleasantnesses in 3 counties before it is over. And the head groom will be here a week longer than any of us wish, because his grace has not yet been given his replacement. And the boy Tom will be teased in the servants' hall for a fortnight for having believed you at dawn on a Tuesday. It isn't over."
"I know."
But. "You lived," said Kitty, and drank her tea. It was 3 nights later, in the last long hour before midnight, that the storm broke over Ravenhold. It came off the north with the low, sustained wind of a March storm that has been gathering 4 counties away, and it came down in a rain that did not, this time, fin, and it lashed the long windows of the great house, and the boards of the far wing, and the slates of the loft above which Wren lay listening. The black stallion, who had not paced in 3 nights, paced. She heard him. She heard, also, past the arcade, past the yard, past the drive, a boy running upon the cobbles in the rain. And she rose, and she dressed, and she came down the loft ladder into a yard already wet, and she found the boy Tom at the door of the tack room with a lantern, and a face wet from more than rain.
"Miss Ashford, there's a slate come off. There's a gap in the boards of the far wing above his box. The wind is at him." His Grace is at the door of the arcade. He asks if you will come." She came. She went with him along the arcade, and she found the Duke at the door of the far wing in a plain riding coat, with the collar up, and no ornament upon him save the small gray pin at his collar, and his hair wet, and the lantern in his hand, and beyond him, in the box, the black stallion at the back, with his head up and his ears half back, and the wind moving, above him, through a gap in the boards where a slate had gone. "Miss Ashford." "Sir?" "Tom will hold the lantern in the arcade. I will hold the horse. Will you go up into the loft above and see if the slate can be steadied from within until morning?" "Yes, sir." She went up. The loft above the far wing was low and dark and full of the sound of wind, and she found the gap where a slate had lifted, and she found, in the small toolbox her father would have called a stable saddler's kit, a length of the same waxed thread with which she had, 6 years, mended a great many other small things. And she did what she could, and it was not much, and it was enough. And by the time she came down again, the wind had, briefly, dropped, and the rain, though it did not thin, had steadied into the long, even fall that a March storm settles into after its first hour. She came out into the arcade. Tom had gone. He had been sent, she understood at once, to the great house on some errand that had been invented for him. The lantern hung upon the peg by the door of the box. The Duke stood inside the box with one hand upon the black stallion's neck, and the animal, blowing a long release along his ribs, standing quiet under his hand. The arcade door was open. The yard beyond it was empty. He looked at her. He did not, at once, speak. She stepped inside the box. She closed the door behind her, and she did not, this time, mind that she had closed it, because the arcade door was open, and the yard was empty, and it was, in the language of the house, a distinction that mattered. And she had, that morning 3 days ago upon a terrace, been given time. He said, "Miss Ashford." "Sir?" He crossed, then, the length of a horse's shoulder. He did not, at once, cross the length of the box. He said, "I have been 3 days composing a sentence, and I have discarded a great many. I have discarded every one of them because it began with the word I. I would like, tonight, if you will permit me, to attempt a sentence that does not begin with the word I. Sir, every time you have been called useful," he said, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not need to, and the rain on the slates above their heads was the only other sound in the world. "The person calling you has meant something else, and I have heard them mean it, and I have said nothing. Every time you have been called stray, the man calling you has meant something else, and I have heard him mean it, and I have said, at last, but not quickly, something. Every time I have come into that yard since the morning of the poultice, I have come because I could not, on that day, account for the fact that I had come the day before, and I have not, until 3 nights ago, permitted myself to admit that I was coming because you were there." He crossed another pace. He was, now, at the black stallion's shoulder. The stallion did not move. "I came home," he said, "to bury a father and to marry a cousin. I did not come home to be seen. I did not come home to be corrected. I did not come home to have my life rearranged around a girl standing beside a mare with her hands folded above her apron. I did not come home, Miss Ashford, expecting any of the things that have happened to me since Tuesday 3 weeks ago. I would like to tell you what has happened to me since Tuesday 3 weeks ago. I would like to tell you in the plainest sentences I can find, and I would like to tell you standing here, in a horse's box, at midnight, in a storm, because it is the first hour and the first room in which I have been able to find, in the whole of a great house, an audience that I trust with the sentences." She said nothing. She stood at the door of the box with her hand at her side, and her hair wet at the temples, and her small, even voice, for once, unavailable to her. He crossed the last pace. He did not touch her. He stood at a horse's shoulder's length from her, no closer, and the small distance was, she understood, a courtesy. "I have come to love you, Wren Ashford." It was, from him, the first use of her name. He said it in the quiet voice she had heard at the door of a Stallion's box, and in the doorway of a tack room, and upon a terrace in the wet March light. And it was, at last, the voice of a man and not of a duke. He said, "I know what the word costs a girl in your position to hear, in a stable, at midnight, from a man in mine. I would not have said it in any other room. I have said it now because I have decided that I will not, tomorrow morning, be able to look at my mother, and to look at Mr. Blunt, and to look at the boy Tom without having first said it to you. And I have decided that I will not, in the arrangement of my life, permit any further syllables to be exchanged between you and me upon any subject at all, until I have said it to you, and until you have, in your own time and in your own words, either believed me or told me plainly that I am to leave the tack room and the arcade and the far wing alone." Wren did not answer. The small, still cold place inside her chest, which had, that morning 3 days ago upon a terrace, held, did not, at these words, dissolve. It held. She felt it hold. She permitted, for the first time in 7 years, the thing beneath it to come, briefly, to the surface. It came in the form of a single tear along the outside of her cheekbone, and it did not, she found, feel like a collapse. It felt like a truth reaching the surface, in the way water reaches the surface of a well one has, for a great many years, been afraid to lower a rope into. And she did not, this time, wipe it away. She said, in the small, even voice that had, at last, come back to her, "Sir? Wren. Not tonight, that either." He did not, this time, quite smile. He waited. She said, "I have been called useful by 3 people in a week, and stray by a 4th, and worse by a 5th. And I have been the subject, in a letter from another woman's dressing room, of an accusation I did not deserve. And I have been believed, this week, by an old woman upon a landing whom I had never met. And I have been given, upon a terrace, a sentence that was not sufficient. And I have been given, tonight, a sentence that is not, either, quite sufficient. And I would like, sir, before I answer it, to say the thing that I have, in 7 years, not, in this house, been permitted to say aloud." "Say it." She said it. She said, "I am worth believing in." He did not at once answer. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the rain on the slates above their heads went on, and the black stallion, at his shoulder, blew a long release along his ribs, and after a long moment he said, in the same quiet voice, "I know. I know you know, sir. I know now. I did not know at breakfast 3 days ago that I would ever hear it said aloud in this house. I have said it, tonight, aloud, in this box, because I would like to hear it said aloud in my own voice before I hear it said aloud in yours. Because I have decided that whatever I permit you to call me hereafter, I will have called myself first by the name I have earned." He did then cross the last small distance. He did not take her by the shoulders. He did not take her by the waist. He took, in his own hand, her hand. He took it in the way one takes a small object one has been given permission to hold. And he did not, at any point in the long moment that followed, let it go. Ren. Yes. May I call you that? You may. Will you marry me? She did not answer at once. She weighed the answer, and she found that the scales, this time, tipped a way she had not permitted herself in 7 years to imagine they could tip. And she said, in the small, even voice that was, at last, entirely her own, "Say it plainly, sir. Not because I am useful. Not because it will silence a house that has begun to talk. Not because you have, in 3 weeks, discovered that a girl at a pump has hands that a saddler at Ely taught. Say it plainly." He said it plainly. He said, "Not because you are useful. Not because it will silence a house. Not because a saddler at Ely taught your hands. Because I have discovered, in 3 weeks, that when there is no one in the arcade and no one at the door of the tack room and no one at the head of the servant stair, you are the person I wish to be standing beside, and I would like, for the rest of my life, to be the person you wish to be standing beside, whether or not any other soul is present to witness that we are." She looked at him a long moment, the small, still cold place inside her chest, which had held, did not at these words break. It settled. It settled into the shape of a hand held in another hand, and she felt it settle, and she said in the smallest voice she had, "Yes, because I wish it." He did not let her hand go. He did not let her hand go through the last hour of the storm, and he did not let her hand go when the wind, an hour later, dropped, and he did not let her hand go when they walked, together, along the arcade to the far door of the far wing, and he did not let her hand go when they stopped, on the threshold, and looked out at the yard, where the rain, at last, had thinned, and where above the far arch, low and clean along the east, a bar of pale sky was widening. He did not let her hand go. It was, in the language of the house, in the language of the yard, in the language of every small thing she had in 7 years done well, the answer, and the question, and the whole of what had passed between them. They stood a moment upon the threshold, and then he lifted her hand, and he set it once against his coat above his heart, and he set it back down at her side, and he let it go at last, in order that they might each of them cross alone the length of the yard to their separate doors, because that too, in the arrangement of the world in which they still, at midnight in March, lived, was a small thing done well. 2 months later, on the first bright morning of May, the yard of Ravenhold was full of people. It was full of every tenant of the estate, and every villager from Eastleigh, and every servant of the great house, and every neighbor within riding distance. And it was full, also, of a great many faces that had not, in a long life, ever crossed the arch. And it was full, above all, of children, who ran between the legs of the horses and were not, this morning, scolded. In the center of the yard, on a low stone dais that had been set up for the purpose, stood the Duke of Ravenhold in plain black. Beside him, in a gown of the muted gray she had chosen, and no ornament upon her save the plain snaffle bridle her father had mended, laid across her arm the way another woman might have carried a bouquet, and, upon the little finger of her left hand, her mother's ring, taken at last from the hem of her cloak and put upon her finger by the dowager in the library on the morning after the storm, stood Wren Ashford, who was, by the end of the morning, to be called something other than Ashford, and was, from the morning after, to be called something other than Miss. Behind them, upon the dais, sat the dowager, with her stick across her knees and her eyes upon the crowd, and her small dry twist at the corner of her mouth. Behind her, holding the bridle of the black stallion, who stood quiet in the sun with his ears forward, and the white sock on his near foreleg like a bandage he had put on himself, stood the boy Tom, who was 15 now and no longer terrified of anything at all. The head groom was not present. He had left Ravenhold 3 weeks after the storm, upon a character that had been, in the dowager's tart aphoristic language, correct without being generous, and he had gone to a small yard in the next county, where he was, by all accounts, a chastened man. Kitty was present. She was in a new gown, and she was, this morning, standing beside a young man from the village whose name she had, until the storm, not permitted anyone to know she had noticed. The Duke lifted his hand. The crowd, who had been talking, went quiet. He spoke, without notes, in the same quiet voice he had used in a stable at midnight, and he spoke it, this morning, at a pitch that carried, because the yard had leaned in to hear him, and he did not need to raise it. He said, "There is a thing I have been asked, in the last 2 months, by a great many people, and I have not yet answered it aloud. I have been asked why, in the choosing of a wife, I did not choose according to the arrangement that had been made for me. I would like to answer it, this morning, in the presence of you all, because the answer belongs to you all, and because it belongs, above all, to the woman standing beside me. They were wrong. Every person who, in this yard, in the last 6 years, called this woman useful, or stray, or a parson's girl, or a piece of furniture that had been left in the tack room when the old Duke died. They were wrong. Every person who, in this house, in the last 2 months, has written to me privately to advise me that I have chosen beneath my standing, they were wrong. Every person who, in the last 7 years, has looked at Wren Ashford and has seen the apron and not the hands, and the muted gown and not the mended bridle, and the quiet voice and not the private ledger. They were wrong. She is the most competent person in this yard, and she has been, since the morning of a poultice upon a mare's hock, 3 weeks after my return. She is the most honest person in this house, and she has been, since the afternoon of a letter that was written in another woman's dressing room. She is the most patient person of my acquaintance, and she has been, since the first evening she stood at the door of a box that she had been ordered not to approach, and did not approach, and waited, because a horse she did not own was, in the night, afraid. I do not know what the county has decided to call the change that has come over Ravenhold in the last 2 months. I know that when I ride out at dawn, my father's last purchase carries me, quietly, at the far side of the fence which no man in this yard had, until March, been able to sit upon him at all. And I know that he carries me because a girl in a muted gown taught him, in the winter, that he had been misread. And I know that she taught him because her mother taught her, at a window in a parson's kitchen, that one does the small things well, and that the large things will not, in the end, be able to overlook one. She was always worth believing in. I have come, late, to know it. I would like this morning to say aloud, to the child in this crowd who is, at the age of 9 or 10, being called useful by someone who is not, in fact, using the word kindly, that a house is not, in the end, changed by the people who arrange it. It is changed by the people who, in the arrangement, do the small things well, and by the people who, in the end, learn to see them. He stopped. The yard was, for a breath, entirely still. Then the applause began. It did not begin at the front. It began at the back, where the tenants stood, and it moved forward, and it was not the small, polite laughter of a drawing room, and not the qualified laughter of a yard rewarded by a rival's wit. It was the applause of a crowd that had, for 6 years, watched a girl carry a bucket, and had for 2 months been given, in the plain reading of that carrying, permission to say aloud what it had, in fact, always known. It was genuine. Wren did not at once permit herself to smile. She stood a moment on the dais with the bridle across her arm and her mother's ring upon her finger, and the small, still cold place inside her chest, which had, that night in a stable, settled into the shape of a hand held in another hand. And she looked, once, along the length of the yard, and she saw, at the back, standing beside her young man, Kitty, who was crying without shame. And she saw, in the middle, the boy Tom holding the bridle of a horse that had, 6 months ago, been called Savage. And she saw, at the front, the children, who had at last stopped running. And she permitted herself, then, the small dry twist at the corner of her mouth that she had earned. She turned to the Duke. She said, in the smallest voice she had, that only he could hear, "It was sufficient." He said, "It was true." He took her hand. He did not let it go. The applause went on. Above the arch, low and clean along the east, the sky was the pale gold of a May morning that had, at some hour in the night, followed a storm. It was not, Wren understood, a perfect morning. Josiah Blunt was in another county, chastened, and would, in time, write a letter she would not, on the Dowager's counsel, answer. Lady Sybil Merivale was in a great house 3 counties away, and would, in time, marry a man of standing and would not, in the arrangement of her life, be corrected again by an old woman upon a landing. Lady Marbury was in a small house in a country town, and was not received. The black stallion had a scar above the near hind fetlock that would, in certain lights, be visible for the rest of his life. The plain snaffle bridle her father had mended had, along the underside of the brow band, 3 small letters stitched in her mother's waxed thread that she had not and would not remove, and would, in time, teach a daughter of her own to find by turning the bridle inward. It was not a perfect morning. It was not, she found, an easy one. It was simply shared, and that was more than enough. She did not let go of his hand. He did not let go of hers. They stepped down together from the dais, and they walked the length of the yard together, and the crowd parted for them without ceremony and without deference, and with the small, warm murmur of a crowd that has, at last, been given permission to be glad. And at the arch they stopped, and they turned, and they looked back once at the yard, and at the dais, and at the Dowager, and at the boy Tom, and at the black stallion standing quiet in the sun. And then they turned again, and, hand in hand, walked out under the arch into the pale gold morning that had, at some hour of the night, followed the storm.